and do the presentation. As I said before, I'm Chuck Dorr of OpenFin. Chuck Danielson is going to be, taking us through integration testing today, using the Selenium and Chrome Driver and a bunch of really great tools. Integration testing we feel is a key part in increasing development velocity. And as you all know, we're all about dev velocity here. So, I've said this in the chat already, but please, if you have questions along the way, please just drop them into the chat, send them to everyone, and I'll be queuing them up. Those that can be answered just via chat, I'll answer, but then I'll feed them to Chuck Danielson for a verbal response. So, without further ado, here is Chuck Danielson.
Thanks, Chuck. So I'm going to hop on my screen here. We've got a little bit of a keynote to get started, and then we're going to dive into just a brief example so you can see some live code. Okay, so integration testing with Selenium. Just some brief thoughts in general on integration testing our app, and give you a high-level idea of the goals that we're really looking to achieve when we start using this tool chain. Number one, we're looking to simulate and validate our user interaction. So this works on a number of levels. We're able to automate users interacting with the front end of our site, and then validate the response and the state of our application afterwards. So immediately we can see some benefits. We can have a laundry list of things that we expect our application to do when certain behaviors are executed, and know that that state is going to persist through different changes and things that happen to the application. In other words, we're able to then protect our existing functionality. So while this is something that's often easy to plan for when we're looking to add new features to something, when we need to cram in some bug fixes or maybe come up with an idea that we want to get rolled out a little quicker than we would otherwise, it's very good to have these. Sorry, we got a screen pop up in the corner there. Not sure how to disable that. There we go. Apologies. So as I was saying, it's very good to have that process automated and actually able to include it in your continuous integration. And on another level, we'll see just a very simple example of it, but it really can help drive design. Many of the testing frameworks, including the one we're using today, are very English friendly. Something that a product manager, even a business owner, can look at and understand what an application on a high level is expected to do. So we're bridging communication gaps between developers and managers, and really coming up with a better definition of how an application should function. And to me, these all encompass every concept that surrounds agile development. As Chuck mentioned, we're very big on development velocity here, and all these parts together can kind of help us achieve that. So let's dive in a little bit to the how. We're going to start with the basic web paradigm. How does one simulate or automate, rather, the interacting and testing of a web application? And there's three parts. Number one is the web driver protocol. And this is simply put a list of rules for communication to a browser driver. So we're going to tell a browser driver how to then interact with and install the version of a browser. We'll expand on this more in some future slides, but at a high level here, we're taking some instructions, passing them along to an intermediary application that speaks to specific versions of browsers, that then executes those commands on the browser. The results and state are passed back to our browser driver, and eventually back up to us, the end user, and translated to English-friendly or programming-friendly, rather, outputs. And the major tool of choice here, and the one that we've highlighted to start, is Selenium. Now, Selenium is a tool that will actually let you automate, any browser that's willing to put a driver together for it. So, from in the web world, this is very beneficial, right? I can write my application specific to one browser, but then test it and run it across all the browsers that are available. as well as maybe different versions of it, right? If I want to look at the newest version of Chrome versus an older version, et cetera. And there's a lot more responsibilities and a lot more bases to cover in that world. So how can we take this paradigm, use this same tool chain to help us do integration testing on our own OpenFin applications? Well, the parts are all there. It's just a matter of putting them together correctly. So let's go back to these pieces we've got here. Number one, we talked about the WebDriver protocol. Luckily for us, on top of that protocol are language bindings. I've highlighted 3 here, specifically because each one of these does have an adapter made available to it on OpenFin. So if you're developing an OpenFin application, it's very likely in-house you're using one of these languages. In today's webinar, much like last one, I'm going to be focusing on JavaScript. It's ubiquity knows no bounds, clearly. But that's going to let us write in the language of our choice, then translate those instructions over to a browser driver. Now, in this particular case, since we're only working with OpenFin, we don't need all of those browser drivers or Selenium standalone server to pull down all these different tools. We just need Chrome driver. Chrome driver is built and maintained by Google, and it is a browser driver meant to control Chromium. Now, anyone familiar with the OpenFin stack knows that Chromium is the bedrock of OpenFin. It is the source of our sandbox model. So if we want to then talk to OpenFin, we can use Chrome driver to talk to the Chromium-based aspects of OpenFin. So this same communication can happen from step to step. At a high level, this makes sense, but now let's get into a little bit more of the details and exactly how we can, rather than control a browser, actually control OpenFin. So I'm going to go over in some bullet points, I'm going to go over in some bullet points exactly how that's going to work. But first, I did want to highlight the PLC and breakdown of a couple of the different JavaScript bindings from one of our all-star devs here, Wenjin, in-house, who put this together. I'm going to be focusing in this webinar specifically on WebDriver IO, but keep in mind this is just I'm just discussing the concepts and how they work at a high level. So if you wanted to do this in one of the other languages or with a different set of bindings, it's just as easy. So to get started, the developer, we're going to launch WebDriver, and that's going to launch with a configuration object. First things first, we need to set the appropriate communication port, right? We need one level of communication from WebDriver to Chrome driver, from WebDriver IO rather to Chrome driver, and that's going to happen over a port that we manually configure, and we'll take a look at that code itself. Next, we actually set the browser to Chrome. So the WebDriver IO knows that we're looking to launch and communicate with some version of Chrome. However, and we'll take a look at this as well, we're actually going to be using a custom binary to launch Chrome. So rather than typically what's going to happen is when you tell WebDriver to use Chrome, it's going to look based on your system to the generic install location where one would typically put Chrome. So on my Mac, it's my app folder. But in this case, and in any case, you can always point to separate versions. In this particular case, we're going to be pointing to a custom binary script. Finally, we're going to pass in a config for our actual app to test, so that this way, when we launch through our custom binary, it knows what app to launch. So now that we've passed some instructions on to Chrome driver is going to need to know exactly what to launch on OpenFin and how. And this is where the custom launch script comes into play. What's happening in the background initially when Chrome driver launches is it's actually targeting that initial Chrome with its own custom set of command line arguments. One of these is very important to us because that's the actual port where communication, and when I'm talking communication, I'm talking instructions from Chrome driver to OpenFin are going to happen. Now we need that passed on to OpenFin. So the script's going to parse the arguments for that remote debugging port and pass that along to the RVM. At this point, it's passed into the RVM, so the communication is going to work both ways. We can pass from one to the other. And I guess one simple thing to remember here is the generic, typically when we're setting up an OpenFin application, we do set a DevTools port so we can do some internal debugging. In this case, you'll want to disable that. because that will actually block you from communicating with Chrome driver. Think of it this way: instead of the developer wanting to manually communicate with OpenFin, we want Chrome driver to do it and automate the entire process. So now, as we can see, again on a high level, there's really only two communications we need to worry ourselves with here, and that's WebDriver IO to Chrome driver, and this is simply a configured port. We set this in the config, and again, we'll take a look at that momentarily, but there's where we tell our WebDriver where it can find Chrome driver waiting for connections. Chrome driver is started up, and then when it starts, when we then launch and actually start our testing process, the arguments are parsed and passed along to the OpenFin runtime, which is the second level of communication. So we really just have two ports here with two tiers of communications, request response cycles, sending messages back and forth. And WebDriver does a lot of heavy lifting for us in taking those messages and turning them into a user-friendly output so we can understand what's happening with our application. So let's dive in now, take a quick look at a simple example so you can see really how easy it is to kind of wire this up when you understand what's happening on a high level. So the first thing I've got up here is actually our config file. This is, you can auto-generate this with their binary, but we're only going to highlight the parts that I had mentioned. Number one, we can see here in our capabilities, I've told WebDriver IO that we are going to be using Chrome, but we want to use a specific set of options. Number one, there's our custom launch script, run openfin.bat, which is available on GitHub in the repo that I actually pointed out earlier. And then there's the arguments targeting the app.json for the actual app I want to test. Here's just a quick look at that script. As you can see, it's parsing through and actually launching the OpenFin RVM. And some other features that I really enjoyed here that can actually help you with continuous integration. WebDriver has hooks. Your typical testing framework will have before and after for each test, or before maybe you run the full test suite. But there's a couple of things that we actually want/need to do before we run our test suite. Number one, I want to host my application locally. I just want to be able to test regularly locally. In the name of development velocity, which is phrase Chuck has got in my mind right now. This can really help you iterate a lot more quickly, and the less things I need to spin up and spin down each time I'm doing something, the better. And then finally, we actually want to start Chrome driver itself. Typically, with Selenium, you'll just have the standalone server running in the background to interact with all of the different browsers you want to automate. But because we only need one, we can wrap it right into our test suite. And then finally, in the end, I'm actually going to call a close on the application. So let's take a look at a simple example I've put together here. And to get started, we'll actually let the test do the talking, as I like to say, and see what some of that nice output looks like. You'll see it actually launched. So right now, the application is hosted right on my virtual machine on port 3000. I've got a Hello World app that launches. And when the tests come up, we'll discuss the functionality. But it actually does this all, right? You can see words being typed in, and that is the WebDriver protocol taking our instructions and passing them on to the machine so it knows exactly what it needs to do with them. So if we take a look at our nice user-friendly output here, my application for a webinar has a home page on launch. Then it shows a second page. I actually verify the OpenFin runtime here. And then it updates the home page when anything but Hello World is submitted. So I guess we can take a look at the test just for a moment. What I want to do is show you that we can continue to add more features. The click-through was actually pretty quick there, but I did throw a couple of pauses in. I'll run it one more time in case it was tough to see. But essentially what's going to happen is when we fill in a field, another window is going to launch. And when we fill in a field with anything but Hello World, as it says, when you update the page with anything but Hello World, we'll get a little message in the box here. So I'm going to close this window now, and you'll see this process automated. And not Hello World yields should say Hello World. But there's a feature missing here, right? And we can add that pretty quickly. Let's say after we're done, we say, yes, that's all nice and well, but it should clear the warning field when Hello World is submitted. So in other words, rather than just persisting that message, that should hide. So I'll run my tests again. And as we'll see, unfortunately, this feature is not going to be implemented. But it's just a quick fix, a few lines of code. And we get the error. Again, user-friendly error here. Expected, you should say hello world to equal blank. So that should be blank. I've already queued up our solution, so we can just see the test pass after we saw them fail. And those pauses that we're seeing here in the application are all configurable. And here we can see here now that it does clear the warning field when the hello world is submitted. So this was a little bit of what I was talking about earlier in terms of driving design. We can see the list of features that our application has. Maybe at that point we can see ones that it's lacking, add them to it, write tests first, and then add the functionality. But having the actual testing framework in place allows us to know that as I'm adding these features and changing things in my application, none of these other things are going to be affected. So me clearing that field isn't changing whether or not something shows up, and it's also not deprecating any other unknown features. Of course, in a simple application, this is just a nicety, but as things grow or things start to sit on our shelves for a lot longer because they've been working, being able to come back to it is quite helpful, and typically will help your development team pick up the project with a lot more pace and understand what's happening a little more on a high level. So just a quick example, but again, the crux of it here is really in the fact that we can use the same tools available to us in web development, right, to test our application functionality as a user would, reliably, automatically, and wrap that into our continuous integration. So as we are running through the unit tests for all the functions that we put together to build an app, we can make sure that all of those pieces are actually working together correctly and doing everything that we want them to do. So a bit of a quick one. I kind of stepped through that rather quickly. I apologize. We're open up to questions now. If anyone has some stuff they would like to discuss, I'm going to go ahead and pop off my screen share for the time being.
Yeah, so Chuck, there was a question from a couple people on the chat asking if the GitHub repo here will be made available to everyone.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. They'll push up on OpenFin, and we'll share the link on our site and on our Twitter as well, so you can have the code for sure. That's one of the major reasons why I jumped on WebDriver.io when I found it too, was really this the on-prepare bunch that let me actually spawn and launch and fully automate it. I find when you can actually run your tests with one line, you're going to run them a lot more often. So that's a great addition and something that you should certainly consider.
We've got a question coming in. The question is from Peter. To what extent is the OpenFin app happy using other testing frameworks like Jest, for example, versus are there specifics that make Selenium the testing tool of choice?
So I'm pausing just because my familiarity with Jest. I'm not sure if that actually automates browsers. In this particular webinar, I'm using, and if you take a look at the tests, I'm using Mocha and Chai simply because this comes pre-configured with WebDriver. So and when I say pre-configured, that's what's giving me the on-prepare hook. I'm using the WebDriver test runner to launch this beforehand. So if you wanted to use a different testing framework, the pieces are all still there. So I don't think there would be any issues. It's just a matter of out-of-the-box configurability, which is why I leaned on this particular solution. So again, at a high level here, all that's happening is we are starting up Chrome driver, which I actually just spawn using native Node, right? This is spawn is literally just child process. And once that's running, we just need anything that's willing to communicate with the WebDriver protocol to pass it along. So the repo that I highlighted earlier that Wenjin put together actually uses a couple of the different JavaScript protocol bindings. So I would see which one of those plays best with Jest, and then I would go forward from there.
Yeah, and I think for our core sort of what we communicate out to our target users, really we're using Selenium just because it's a widely used tool. Anything that supports the WebDriver standard, is compatible with the environment. There are there are a bunch of different tools that we see people using in the wild. And like I said, if they support the WebDriver standard, then they are compatible with us.
To nod to that too, this is something that is still growing and evolving, right? WebDriver is even pushing out some more action protocols. They may be out now, but they'll be making them over to all of these language bindings in the short term. Maybe some of them even have them already. But it's nice to kind of get involved now because it still is growing, and it's clearly a very important part of being able to move with agility as you're working as a development team. But yeah, to Chuck's point, anything that's willing to take the protocol and pass it along to a driver. So I'm assuming for most of those it should be there.
And we have a follow-up question here, really, I guess, sort of unrelated, but the question is, does OpenFin allow access to the extensions API to extend the Chrome DevTool console for the Windows? I think that one we actually have to take offline. I know we've had, generically have extension support and have had things like historically Batarang for Angular and other DevTools extensions being used. In more recent versions, I haven't seen that, so I'm just not sure if the support there has waned a bit. But we'll post that information as well. Do we have any more questions about the webinar or testing in general?
So do we have to run Selenium Server in the background for tests to run? No, because what Selenium Server is actually doing is running the web drivers. So rather than us starting up Selenium Server, we are actually just starting the driver ourselves. You could start a Selenium Server just starting Chrome driver, but I think it'd be a little heavy lifting. And I actually, in this repo, just packaged the version of Chrome driver that corresponds to the version of Chrome the version of Chromium that OpenFin is based off of. So, so think of this. Think of the Selenium Server as kind of a middleman that can work with all the different web drivers. So we actually don't need that extra piece for this particular use case, which is why we we just spin up the Chrome driver in itself. It's kind of like an API shift from Selenium 1 to 2, where in Selenium 1 you had remote control with Selenium driver. I'm sorry, with Selenium server. Now with Selenium 2, it's typically some sort of WebDriver language binding with the WebDrivers of choice. And the WebDriver docs actually has ways to configure them both, but this is their recommended build process, the one we highlighted today. And I could say that after going through both processes, I definitely saw the upside to building this config and having the tests all launch from one place. So I would recommend that. But
Right. Do we have any more questions? I'm gonna do 30 seconds of silence here equals no more questions. So any more questions, send them our way.
yeah, feel free to reach out when the repo is posted. Any questions, pull requests are always welcome. So how does this compare with Spectron, or can it integrate with it? It's pretty close. It's a similar process, right? Integration with it, I would say, would just be a matter of how you want to run those tests in what order. Like, I don't think you'd be launching both apps simultaneously, and if you did, you would probably need one layer of extraction out from that. But it is a very similar process in terms of the steps going through. One thing I did fail to highlight that I did want to show actually very quickly, and I'll just hop my screen up here, is that you can from here. I talked about the test in the OpenFin runtime version, and keep in mind that this really is just passing on and executing JavaScript in the browser context. I actually alias my app to browser here, but copy paste me. And what we're really doing is calling the OpenFin API and calling it from within that context. So I'm not sure why that came to mind right there, but I realized I did forget to highlight that, so I just wanted to point that out as well to everyone who's stuck around to this point. If you have any questions on that, feel free to elaborate as well.
Okay, guys. At this point, if we don't have any more questions, I'd first like to thank Chuck Danielson for taking us all through this great content. As we've said a couple times, but I'll just remind everyone, the recording of this webinar will be up next week, and we will get the GitHub repo that's being used here published out as soon as we can. Expect that before the video, probably. On the sort of general OpenFin announcements front, for those of you that are based in London or who will be in London next week, I just wanted to remind you that FinJS is next Tuesday. We have an incredible lineup of speakers there, including the CEO of Trading Technologies. If you're not familiar with Trading Technologies and what they do, they have, they have the most highly performant web technology front end in finance right now. So you will have the opportunity to meet Rick, talk to him about all the stuff that they did as a team to get to levels of performance that, frankly, we just haven't seen before. And I think if we work really hard, some of us might be able to catch up to them over the next year or so. Anyway, FinJS is going to be an incredible event in London next Tuesday, and we're looking forward to seeing you all there. As well as at our next webinars. So thank you, and thanks for attending.